Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to Virginia in May 1864, the beginning of the end for General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. Let's zoom in to the Union supply base at Belle Plain on May 13th. The scene is bustling with activity as the Overland Campaign is underway. Started a little more than a week ago. And in recent days, the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania have resulted in mass casualties. Wounded soldiers transported from makeshift field hospitals in vicinity of the battlefields are arriving hourly in horse-drawn ambulances and any other way they can possibly get there. Many of these men are in a dire condition. Attendants are reaching into the ambulances. They are grabbing stretcher handles and delicately lifting these desperately wounded soldiers out of the ambulances and off to the side of the road so that incoming supply wagons loaded with food, medicine, blankets, ammunition, and just about everything else an army on the move needs can pass by. They're on their way to the front lines. All of the wounded are making their way to Belle Plain and onward to Washington. As the stretchers with their precious cargo are waiting for outbound transport vessels in the way of ships and other vehicles, there's a group of folks who are pitching in to help out, and they're caregivers from the United States Sanitary Commission. They're moving to and fro from wounded soldier to wounded soldier, talking with other soldiers who are trying to help. They're providing some measure of relief to these waiting patients. These Sanitary Commission folks, they're stalwart men and women from across the Union states, and they are tireless, working literally until they collapse from exhaustion. One of these caregivers is pictured here. His name is Alfred Bloor. He's an assistant secretary with the Sanitary Commission. He's a son of Scotland who has just celebrated his 36th birthday. Bloor had left his homeland and immigrated to New York City with his family as a teenager. Settling in Brooklyn, he embarked on a career as an architect and worked with some of the best in the profession, including a name you may know, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed New York's Central Park. When the war came, Olmsted became a general secretary of the Sanitary Commission. Bloor joined him as an assistant secretary. The nonprofit commission raised huge sums of money and spent it on a myriad of varied supplies for the troops. And they sent volunteers to Belle Plain and elsewhere around the country. In his role as an assistant secretary, Bloor communicated with many movers and shakers in the government, among them names you know, President Abraham Lincoln, Senator Charles Sumner, Chief of Nurses Dorothea Dix, and many, many more. You can find existing letters in the National Archives and elsewhere. Bloor, being a good secretary and a good member of the commission, also spent time in the field for brief periods to get a better understanding of the needs of the soldiers and how best to keep them supplied and to understand what their needs were. That May 1864 trip that I talked about at the beginning of this video to Belle Plain during the Overland Campaign was one of the many trips. On May 14th, a day after this May 13th visit, he wrote a letter that describes the hustle and bustle of Belle Plain and how it was interrupted by Union guards marching Confederate prisoners of war fresh from the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, including 2 generals, to northern prisons. I want to read you the excerpt, but before I do, listen for the mention of the Confederate generals, George Hume Steuart of Maryland and Edward Johnson of Virginia and Kentucky, Both men were captured at Spotsylvania during the fighting in the Bloody Angle at the Mule Shoe Salient. Steuart famously refused to shake the hand of Union Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, a man he had known in the old army. Bloor also mentions Belle Isle Prison in Richmond, which had become notorious for the poor conditions and the suffering by Union prisoners of war who were there. He also mentions Fort Pillow, Tennessee, where just a month earlier, Confederate soldiers under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest murdered Black U.S. soldiers, and Fort Delaware, where Confederates, including many in the group here, were going to be held as they were sent north. With these notes, let me read this excerpt from Bloor's letter. Quote, during the repast, they had just grabbed a quick meal after working literally all day to take care of the wounded men coming in. During the repast, we discover that there is a suspension of ambulances and stretchers to allow the passage of some thousands of rebel prisoners from Dixie to the land of the free in Fort Delaware and elsewhere, the freedom of such strongholds being the kind they seem most to appreciate. Pretty soon, there marched along, under guard, 3 men dressed in rebel gray and unarmed, except for the black feather cavalier fashion across the front of the hat and for the 3 stars on the upturned collar of one of them. They might have been taken, so far as dress was concerned, for privates, but these insignia showed the rank of a brigadier general in the Confederate service. This was General Steuart, a handsome fellow, some 35 years old, I should judge, and who endeavored to conceal his feelings beneath a jaunty and somewhat defiant manner. His older companion, wrapped up in a gray overcoat without any insignia of rank visible, and whose grizzly hair showed through sundry rents the most shocking bad hat I ever saw, is Major General Johnson, and the third prisoner is his adjutant general. Being brought to a halt, they sit down on some boxes, and Johnson draws from his pocket a copy of the Washington Morning Chronicle, and, picking out the war news, reads something in a low tone to Steuart, who answers by a nervous laugh. Not placing implicit confidence myself in the war news of most of our newspapers, I fancy they may have discovered some slight mistake and therefore feel no inclination to resent their raillery. But the crowd around are not so lenient, probably thinking strongly on the subject of Belle Isle and Fort Pillow, and the murmurs increase until there is, for a minute, danger of violence being offered to the prisoners. But a few stern words from the captain of the guard and the ringing of bayonets of the latter soon restore order, and the generals and adjutant are marched quietly off to the boat that is to convey them to Fort Delaware or wherever else. In a little while, they are followed by a multitude of rebel officers, 400 in number, it is said, of every rank from colonel to second lieutenant, but none with any marks of rank detectable, except in the few cases where the coat collar was turned up, or where one of 2, more dandified than the rest, had decorated the lapels of their coats with their insignia. At first, I thought they were privates, for even apart from their dress, they presented, in the mass, little evidence of superiority to the rank and file of our men. But I was told that the large body of their fellow prisoners of the rank and file who followed them, they came shortly after, but I was too busy to look at them, were decidedly inferior to them in all respects. One of them, almost a boy, entered into a political argument with one of the guards, an old sergeant from New York, who stood by me, embracing the questions of slavery, the constitutional right of secession, and etc., and which, notwithstanding my suggestion that if verbal argument had proved of any avail to settle the differences between the North and South, they, who were now disputing, would not have been called upon to fight each other, finally grew general and warm, and was only finished by the party being marched off to their quarters. End quote. So there you have Bloor's description of the encounter with Confederate prisoners, the two generals, Steuart and Johnson, and the boy who got into a heated argument with a sergeant. Bloor's full letter and 7 others about his experiences in May of 1864 were sent to various correspondents, all women, and all women officials in the Sanitary Commission, to help them appreciate the benefits of their labors and those of the larger organization. These 8 letters were published in a 68-page book titled Letters of the Army of the Potomac. This thin book, almost a booklet, was circulated. It was produced in a limited number of volumes and circulated among commission members. Bloor served in this role, assistant secretary of the commission, through the rest of the war, and afterward, he returned to his career as an architect. He served as an officer after that in numerous professional organizations, and notably was among the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Bloor lived a long life, dying in 1917 after a stroke at age 89. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.